I stood at my wife's funeral and told our children something that changed everything they thought they knew about their mother. My name is Robert. I am 70 years old and I have been married to the same woman for 46 years, and I want to tell you about her. Not the woman our children knew, the warm, steady, endlessly patient woman who made Sunday dinners and remembered every birthday and always knew what to say when one of them called at midnight in tears. I want to tell you about the girl she was before all of that. The girl she never talked about. The girl she buried so deeply inside herself that sometimes I think even she forgot she had ever existed. Her name was Margaret. That was the name she was born with, and the name she left behind when she was 13 years old, and walked away from everything she had ever known. The name she took when she came to our city, when she built her new life, when she became the woman I fell in love with, was Catherine. And for 46 years, Catherine was who she was. Catherine was who she chose to be. And I think that choice, made by a terrified 13-year-old girl with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate need to survive, was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed in my life. I met Catherine in the spring of 1978. I was 24 and working at a small accounting firm downtown, and she was 22 and waitressing at the diner 2 blocks from my office where I ate lunch 3 times a week. She had this way of moving through that diner like she owned every inch of it, completely sure of herself, completely present, always 3 steps ahead of what anyone needed. I thought she was the most capable person I had ever seen. I asked her out 4 times before she said yes, and when she finally did say yes, she looked at me very directly and said, "I don't talk about my past and I never will. And if that's going to be a problem, then we should probably skip this." I said it wasn't a problem. I didn't fully understand, at 24, what I was agreeing to. But I said yes anyway because I already knew, in the way you sometimes just know, that this woman was going to matter to me. We dated for 2 years and got married in the summer of 1980. By then I knew a little more than I had at the beginning. Not much. Catherine was careful, always careful, but enough. I knew that she had come from somewhere she didn't want to go back to. I knew that she had no contact with her family and didn't want any. I knew that her childhood had been something she described, on the one occasion she ever came close to describing it, as something I survived. She said it quietly, without drama, the way you say something that is simply true and doesn't require elaboration. I didn't push. It wasn't in me to push her on something she had closed so firmly. And besides, the woman sitting across from me at that kitchen table was so completely whole, so completely herself, that it felt almost wrong to go looking for cracks. We had 3 children. Michael came first, in 1982. He is 42 now and looks so much like his mother around the eyes that sometimes, in the weeks since she passed, I have had to look away. Then came our daughter Laura in 1984, and then our youngest, Daniel, in 1987. Catherine was a remarkable mother. I don't say that the way people say it at funerals, reaching for something kind because kindness is what the moment requires. I say it because it was simply, observably true. She was present in a way that I think only people who know what absence really feels like can be. She never missed a school play or a football game or a parent-teacher conference. She remembered which of Michael's friends he'd had a falling out with, and which of Laura's teachers she found unfair, and which television program Daniel had to watch on Friday evenings or his whole week felt incomplete. She knew her children the way a person knows something they have chosen, deliberately, and with their whole heart. She never talked about her own childhood. Not once, in 46 years, in front of the children. If they asked, and they did ask, when they were young, the way children ask about grandparents and family trees and where they come from, she would say simply that she had a difficult childhood and that she preferred not to discuss it, and then she would change the subject with such graceful finality that they learned, eventually, not to ask again. I think they assumed something sad but ordinary. A difficult home. Parents who weren't kind. The kind of thing that happens to people and that people quietly carry and move on from. They had no idea. None of them had any idea. Catherine was diagnosed with cancer 18 months before she died. She handled it the way she handled everything, practically, without self-pity, with a kind of focused determination to manage what could be managed and accept what couldn't. She went through treatment. She had good months and hard months. And then, about 6 months before the end, when it became clear that the treatment wasn't working the way we had hoped, she sat me down at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where she had once told me she didn't talk about her past, and she said it was time. "I want you to tell them," she said. "After. Not before, because I don't want their last months with me to be about that. But after, Robert. They should know who I was before I was their mother. They should know what she survived." I asked her if she was sure. She looked at me with those steady eyes she had and said, "I spent my whole life being sure. Let me be sure about this too." So I promised. And I kept that promise until the day of her funeral, 3 weeks ago, when I stood up in front of our 3 children and the people who had loved her, and I said, "Before I tell you about the woman your mother became, I need to tell you about the girl she was." I had rehearsed what I was going to say. I had written notes, crossed them out, written them again. I had practiced in the bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning 3 days before the funeral, while Catherine's side of the bed was still empty, and the house was so quiet it had a sound of its own. But when I stood up in front of those people and looked at my 3 children in the front row, Michael with his jaw set the way he sets it when he's trying not to feel something, Laura with her hands folded in her lap so tightly her knuckles were white, Daniel leaning slightly forward the way he always has since he was small, like he doesn't want to miss anything, every prepared word left me completely. So I just told them the truth. I told them that their mother was born Margaret, in a small town about 200 miles from where we were sitting. That she was the oldest of 4 children in a family where there was never enough of anything, not food, not warmth, not safety. That her father drank and her mother followed his lead in everything, including the violence. That Catherine had told me, on the one night in our 46 years together when she talked about it directly, that she could not remember a single week of her childhood without pain. Not 1 week. She said it without anger, which was almost harder to hear than if she had said it with rage. She said it the way you state a fact about weather or geography. This was simply the landscape she had grown up in. I saw Laura's hands tighten in her lap. I kept going. I told them that when Catherine was 13 years old, her parents told her she was going to start earning money for the family. That the way they intended for her to earn it was not something a 13-year-old girl should ever be asked to do. That she understood immediately what they meant and that she made a decision, alone, in the middle of the night, with the clarity that sometimes comes to people when they are standing at the absolute edge of something they cannot survive. She packed what she could carry in a bag that wasn't even really hers. She walked out of that house before dawn, and she never went back. Michael made a sound. Just a small one, quickly controlled, but I heard it. I looked at him for a moment, and then I looked back at the room and I continued. She made her way to the city over the course of several days, traveling however she could, eating whatever she could find. She was 13 years old and completely alone, and she was more determined than anyone I have ever known. When she arrived she found work, cleaning, mostly, and later waitressing, and she found a room in a boarding house run by an older woman named Agnes who asked very few questions and charged very little rent and who Catherine spoke of, in the rare moments she spoke of that time at all, with a quiet and particular gratitude. Agnes was the first person, she told me once, who had ever been kind to her without wanting something in return. She changed her name. Margaret became Catherine, after a saint she had read about in a book she found in Agnes's sitting room, a woman, she told me, who had survived things she shouldn't have survived and kept going anyway. She chose a new last name from a street sign she passed every morning on her way to work. She built a new history, carefully and completely, the way you build something you intend to last. She told no one where she had come from. She let the girl named Margaret go as completely as she could, and she became Catherine, and Catherine was who she remained for the rest of her life. By the time I met her she was 22 and she had been Catherine for 9 years. She was so completely herself that I never once, in all our years together, thought of her as someone who was hiding. She wasn't hiding. She had simply chosen. There is a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it properly, but I understand it now. She didn't run from Margaret out of shame. She walked away from Margaret to survive, and then she built Catherine out of nothing but her own will and her own intelligence and her own extraordinary capacity to love people well, and that is not hiding. That is the most remarkable kind of courage I know. I told our children all of this. I stood at their mother's funeral and I told them everything she had asked me to tell them, and when I finished the room was so quiet I could hear the flowers. And then Laura stood up. She didn't say anything at first. She walked to the front of the room where the photograph of Catherine was displayed, the one we had chosen together, taken about 10 years ago on a summer holiday, where she is laughing at something just outside the frame with her whole face, the way she laughed, and she stood in front of it for a long moment. And then she turned around and looked at Michael and Daniel, and she said, very quietly, "She never told us because she didn't want us to carry it. That's exactly what she would do." Michael stood up then. He is not a man who cries easily. He is 42 years old, and he has his mother's jaw and his mother's eyes and his mother's particular stubbornness about showing weakness. And he stood up and his voice was thick when he spoke, but he spoke clearly. "She gave us everything she never had," he said. "Every single thing. She knew exactly what a childhood was supposed to feel like because she never had one, and she made sure we did." He stopped for a moment. "Every Sunday dinner. Every football game. Every time she picked up the phone at midnight." He shook his head slowly. "She knew what it meant because she knew what the opposite felt like." Daniel was the last to speak. He is the youngest and the quietest, and has always been the one who needed the longest to find his words, but when he finds them they tend to be the right ones. He looked at the photograph of his mother, and he said, "I wish she had told us. I wish we could have told her that it didn't change anything. That she was still exactly who she always was to us. That we were proud of her." His voice broke on the last word and he let it break, and he said, "I am so proud of her." I sat back down after that. There was nothing left to say that the three of them hadn't already said better than I could have. We stayed at that church for a long time after the service ended. People came and went, offered their condolences, said the things people say. But my three children stayed close to each other, and close to me in a way they hadn't since they were small, and at some point Michael put his arm around my shoulders and Laura took my hand and Daniel leaned his head briefly against my arm, and we stood there together in front of Catherine's photograph, the four of us, in the particular silence of people who have just been handed something heavy and precious at the same time. On the way out, Laura stopped at the door and looked back at the photograph one last time. "She made it," she said. Not to anyone in particular. Just out loud, into the air of that church. "She really made it." And I said, "She did. She really did." And we walked out together into the afternoon light.